So, speaking of last things, we end up with a bang with the apocalyptic literature, which we were sampling last day in the book of Daniel. Now, the last chapters of Daniel from 7 to 12, sometimes regarded as prophecy. In the Greek Bible, the Christian Bible, usually it's classified as prophecy. Daniel is regarded as one of the four major prophets, but his prophecy is a bit different from some of the earlier prophets. Now, you can say that this is a gradual change. There are some things that distinguish Daniel from, say, Isaiah, that you already find to some degree in Ezekiel and Zechariah. But still, there is still further difference, I would say, in Daniel. So, major differences. First of all, there's the nature of the revelation. In the apocalyptic literature, they're very much emphasizing that the revelation is supernatural. You cannot understand it if left to yourself. There is a nice passage in Daniel chapter 9 where he says that he alone saw the vision. Other people who were with him didn't see it. He didn't want anybody coming along and saying, no, Daniel, that isn't actually what happened. It is a vision by revelation. If you don't have the revelation, you can't understand it. And so in that sense, you can't refute it. You can't argue with it. It's a very absolute kind of claim. Connected to that is that it is much more interested in a heavenly world than was the case in any earlier prophet. At the end of the book of Deuteronomy, it says, the word of God is not in heaven that you should say, how will we go up to heaven and bring it down? Now, for the apocalyptic literature, it is in heaven. The other great apocalyptic figure besides Daniel in the early period is Enoch. Now, you probably didn't spend much time, if any, on Enoch. He appears in the early chapters of Genesis, 7th after Adam, in the begats. His claim to fame is that he walked with God and he was not, for God took him. That's all. He also lived 365 years, which probably has something to do with the length of a year. But now, in the later literature now, in the literature of the period that we're dealing with at the end of the course, in the Hellenistic period, Enoch suddenly became prolific. You know, he had been for a couple of thousand years without writing anything. And then he suddenly bursts on the scene in the 3rd century or early 2nd century and produces a whole string of writings. Now, these writings are supposedly the accounts of what he saw when he walked with God or walked with the angels. It's Elohim in Hebrew, which can be either, it's a plural noun, so it can mean either the angels or God. So the way the tradition develops, Enoch was thought to have hung out with the angels at a certain point in his life, and to have had tours of heaven or tours of otherworldly regions. And then at the end of his life, he doesn't die, he's taken up to heaven. Enoch, Elijah, and possibly Moses are the only people for whom that was said before the book of Daniel. Now, the apocalypses of Enoch are, in many cases, what we call heavenly ascents. They're accounts of going up to heaven and accounts of what he saw there. And what he saw there, on the one hand, he sees things like the storage places of the winds and the snow. The idea being that God must have reservoirs up there out of which he produces all these things on occasion. But he also sees there the abode of the dead, where they're waiting for the judgment, and also the places where God will come down to judge the earth at the end of time. These are also revelations shown to Enoch. In some of the other Enoch apocalypses, then you also get a prediction of all of history. Now, Enoch was very well placed for that. He was seventh after Adam. He could predict the whole course of history down to the time when the book was actually written. So that part, those writings of Enoch are much more like Daniel than some of the ascent parts. So, in general, then you have two types of apocalyptic writings. You have one that describes heavenly ascents, that tells you all the things you don't know as a human being, all the things that are beyond the reach of human knowledge. And on the other hand, you have the overview of history, usually attributed to somebody who's supposed to have lived a long time ago, so that he can predict the whole course of history, and you can see that he got most of it right, because it has already happened by the time the book is published. But then, of course, it will always end with something that is a real prediction that goes beyond that which anybody has yet seen, and usually has to do with the end of history. So these are the two main types of apocalypse. Now, there's a much bigger role for angels and demons than you ever have in the earlier part of the Old Testament. It is really only in the apocalyptic literature that angels and demons burst on the scene, so to speak. This is where you begin to get angels with proper names, like Michael and Gabriel. You get those in the books of Enoch, and you also get them in Daniel. Daniel is the only book in the Old Testament that gives specific names for angels. And then probably the biggest difference of all over against the earlier literature is the belief in resurrection and judgment. Now, we talked a little bit about that last day. Resurrection in this literature does not normally mean coming back on earth with a body of flesh and blood. It means being taken out of the netherworld and exalted up to heaven, or taken somewhere else if you are to be punished. But it's a spiritual body that seems to be raised in most of these cases. In the books of Maccabees, you do get the idea of a very physical bodily resurrection. But the more typical thing is that the resurrection of a kind of spiritual body. It's still some kind of a body, there's some kind of stuff to it, and it has the possibility, the main thing really is that you have a judgment of the dead. So that it's not the case anymore that everybody just goes to Sheol and gets depressed for all eternity. It is now the case that people come back to life. At least some people come back to life and are judged. So some people can hope for a beatific afterlife, and other people can hope for a rather unpleasant one. So that's, I think, probably the biggest change that happens with this literature. Now, with that in mind, we'll turn back to the book of Daniel. Probably the most famous chapter in the book of Daniel is Daniel chapter 7. And the reasons why it's famous are obvious, at least from a Christian point of view, because it speaks of the coming of a figure who is one like a son of man, somebody who looks like a human being, who comes on the clouds of heaven. And this vision, of course, gets repeated and updated in the New Testament. So Daniel chapter 7. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, I, Daniel, had a dream and visions of his head as he lay in bed. And then it switches to first person. I, Daniel, saw in my vision by night Four winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. Now, four winds, that's the four cardinal points. That's a way of saying all the winds of heaven. And the great sea would normally be the Mediterranean, but here it's really more a mythical sea. And it alerts you right at the beginning that there are echoes here of ancient myths. Way back at the beginning of the first semester of Old Testament, I assume you did spend some time talking about things like the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, and the Canaanite creation myth that has the story of the god Baal doing battle with the sea and its monsters. Now, the sea and its monsters actually reverberate through all of the Old Testament. You have it in the book of Job. It said that when God created the world, he pierced Rahab and slew the dragon that was in the sea. You also get this in Isaiah chapter 51 and in Isaiah 27, where it's projected into the future that at the end of time, God will slay the fleeting dragon and slay Leviathan in Isaiah chapter 27. So that imagery of the turbulent sea is familiar enough. I think any Jew would recognize the connotations of it. Now, what come up out of it here are four great beasts. And here, the author brings the changes on the tradition. As in Daniel chapter 2, the claim is that all of history is divided among four kingdoms. Now, in Daniel chapter 2, it was the statue, the head of gold, the chest of silver, and so forth, down to the feet of clay. In this case, it works a little differently. In this case, there are four great beasts who come up out of the sea. The first is like a lion and an eagle's wings. And then the second is a bear, taken to represent the Medes. And it's told, arise, devour many bodies. After this, another one, a leopard. Leopards were noted for their speed, and this one represents the Persian Empire, because the Persians were the first people in the ancient world who rode horses and moved much faster than armies had done before them. And whereas in Daniel chapter 2, the fourth kingdom was the weakest one, in this one, it's rather the strongest. After this, I saw in the visions by night a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. And I was considering then it sprouted 10 horns, and while Daniel was watching, a little horn comes up, an upstart, and it displaces 3 of the earlier horns. Now, all of this, you might reasonably say, was a nightmare. It's representing, as we will be told, the course of history, and the fourth beast is the kingdom under which they are now living. And it will become clear this is the kingdom of the Greeks. This is after Alexander the Great. The 10 horns represent a series of kings. Now, people argue as to exactly how they should be identified. I'm not sure they even should be identified specifically, but it's clear enough that the last one, the upstart, is the one we know as Antiochus Epiphanes. We talked about him last day. He is the man who tried to suppress the Jewish cult in Jerusalem, and he is the one who sets up what becomes known as the abomination of desolation. But then, while this fourth little horn is carrying on, as I watched, this is chapter 7, verse 9, thrones were set in place, and an Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head was pure wool, his throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000,000 served him, 10,000 times 10,000 stood around him. Who is this? Well, if you had a vision like this, would you know who you were seeing? This is, I think, obviously in the context, this is the Most High God. The imagery with which he is depicted with the white hair is associated with the Canaanite god El in the ancient world. But he is an ancient figure here, as El also was depicted as an ancient figure. But it is obviously the supreme God. Then I watched because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. And as I watched, the beast was put to death and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. So the fourth beast, the kingdom of the Greeks, including Antiochus Epiphanes, are judged and committed to the fire. Then, in verse 13, as I watched in the night visions, I saw, the traditional translation is, one like a son of man. Now, what it means is one who looked like a human being. The point being made that he looks like a human being, whereas the other figures looked like beasts, like strange hybrid beasts, in fact. It does not mean that he was a human being. In fact, it probably means that he wasn't. And in fact, in some of the Enochic books, you also have various figures depicted as animals. There's a whole apocalypse of Enoch known as the apocalypse of the animals, the animal apocalypse. And in that, typically, then some figures are singled out as being men. And these are figures like Noah, who are taken up to heaven. Very often in visions, also in Daniel, when he sees something that looks like a man, it will turn out to be an angel, to be a supernatural being, but that bears a general resemblance to a human being. Now, he was coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and kingship, and that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, etc. Now, the problem of this vision in the Jewish context is that before this time in the Old Testament, whenever you get reference to a figure who is riding the clouds, it's Yahweh, the God of Israel. In the old Ugaritic texts from the second millennium, it's Baal. Baal is known as the rider of the clouds. In the Canaanite or Ugaritic context, that isn't really a problem, because you can have two gods. You have El and Baal. In the Jewish context, it is a problem, because the imagery traditionally used for Yahweh here appears to be the lower God, a second God. Now, people have reacted to this in different ways. Daniel Boyarin, who is a great Jewish scholar who teaches at Berkeley, says, well, this was a feature of Israelite religion from ancient times, that there was a second power in heaven. Now, it certainly seems to have been a feature of our Israelite religion in the very early period, back before David and Solomon. You get it in Deuteronomy. You get some passages that seem to distinguish El and Yahweh. But you have nothing like that for a good 1,000 years before Daniel was written. Michael Siegel, a scholar at the Hebrew University who is writing a commentary on Daniel, gave a paper at SBL some years ago in which he said, well, this imagery always refers to Yahweh, so we should take it that it refers to Yahweh here. And then he asked another scholar before he gave his paper, another Jewish scholar, how should I refer to God? You know, because Jews don't pronounce the divine name. And the other scholar said to him, you're saying there's another God above him? If you're saying that, what you call him is the least of your problems. So I think Siegel backtracked a little bit off that theory in the meantime, because it does seem very unlikely that they were thinking of really two gods. What the figure riding on the clouds, well, we'll see the rest. There is an interpretation given which does not entirely solve the problem. Yes, somebody, yeah, okay, got the question. Now, as to the interpretation that is given, first of all, we're told these four great beasts are four kings or kingdoms that arise on the earth. But the holy ones of the Most High will receive the kingdom. And then it goes on and gives a more detailed interpretation relating to the 10 horns and the little horn. And the little horn is the one who speaks words against the Most High, shall wear out the holy ones of the Most High, shall attempt to change the seasons of the law, and they shall be given into his power for a time, 2 times, and half a time, which is to say 3.5 years. But then in the end, the kingship and dominion under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. So you have 3 statements of how the kingdom is in the end given. One time it's given to this one like a son of man who comes on the clouds. Then it's given to the holy ones. And then it's given to the people of the holy ones. Now, a lot of the older commentaries on Daniel just assumed that the holy ones were the Jewish people. But in fact, nearly every time that you get a reference to a holy one or holy ones, even in the Hebrew Bible, with one possible exception in the Psalms, but certainly in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the books of Enoch, and elsewhere in Daniel, a holy one is an angel. A holy one is a particular rank of angel. In fact, higher up angels, so to speak. The people of the holy ones, I think that probably does mean the Jewish people. But what you're getting here, in fact, is a scene that has 3 levels. Like the one riding on the clouds isn't just a representation of Israel. He is a representation of the leader of Israel. And we saw last day in chapters 10 to 12 who the leader of Israel was supposed to be. And it is not the Lord directly. It is Michael, the archangel, who is called the Prince of Israel. And that, I figure, is what is meant here by the one like a son of man. That this is the patron angel of Israel. When he gets the kingdom, then the whole host of the holy ones gets it, and the people of the holy ones. But it's a 3-level thing, so to speak. Now, so what this vision is saying on the whole is that this is a throwback to the battle of creation. It's a battle on the order of Marduk against Tiamat, of Baal against Yam. Only this time it is the Prince of Israel who is going to be exalted, and the beast from the sea will be thrown to the flames. Some people have asked, how would Daniel in the 2nd century BC have known the myth that we only know from tablets that came from the middle of the 2nd millennium? But I think there's a probable link for it. And that is what's called the abomination of desolation, which was something installed in the temple, probably a pagan altar, was actually a pun in Hebrew on the god Baal Shemaim, god of heaven. The abomination was called the Shikutz Meshomaim, the destroying abomination. And I think that's what had happened, was that Antiochus Epiphanes had installed a cult of Baal in the temple. And so what Daniel is saying is, it's not Baal who defeats the monster from the sea, it's Yahweh and his patron angel, Michael. Now, this has ramifications for Messianic expectation. From a very early point, this figure riding on the clouds is called a Messiah. The earliest interpretation that we have of this vision is in one of the books of Enoch, the Similitudes of Enoch, where Enoch sees a figure who is referred to as that Son of Man, and he also sees a white-headed figure with him, and it's obviously a reenactment of Daniel's vision. But he will also refer to that Son of Man as a Messiah. And in the Similitudes of Enoch, that Son of Man gets to sit on the heavenly throne. This may have been implied in Daniel, but it's not actually said, that this figure would be enthroned in heaven. That one is interesting because in the Gospel of Matthew, it also says that the Son of Man will sit on his throne of glory for the final judgment. So he becomes, in effect, a new kind of Messiah. To speak of a new kind of Messiah, you have to be clear, first of all, on what was the old kind of Messiah. And the Messiah was a term, we met it in the Psalms, in Psalm 2, for example. It could be used for the king, and that was the king of the day. Increasingly, in the Second Temple period, Messiah means the figure who will restore the kingdom of Israel. Interestingly enough, in the book of Daniel does not have any reference to a human figure who would restore the kingdom of Israel. Even though it seems to be promising that the Jews would inherit the kingdom eventually, nonetheless, this will be brought about by the angels, by Michael and the heavenly host, not by a Messiah acting on earth. In fact, the whole idea that there would be a Messiah to restore the kingdom of Israel, well, you get it in the prophets, you get it after the destruction of Babylon, you get it for a while, but it seems to have died out or become dormant. It revived in the 1st century BC, and we know this because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the 1st century BC, Jerusalem was conquered by the Romans. The Roman general Pompey came to Jerusalem. And it's partly in reaction to the Roman conquest, and partly in reaction to the fact that the descendants of the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, set themselves up as kings when they were not descended from David. And some people said they had no right to do that. God did not give them the promise. They didn't have a right to set themselves up as kings. And so the fact that they did gave rise to a renewed messianic expectation, which was to say the hope for a king from the line of David. in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in other books of the time, there is a very clear job description for this Messiah. The job description was for a mighty warrior who would defeat the foreigners, the Romans in this case, smash heads. There is a prophecy attributed to Balaam in the book of Numbers that talks about a scepter and a star. And the scepter was said, would smash the heads of the opponents, of the enemies. And this, I think, is probably what most people were hoping for. About 100 years after Jesus, there was a revolt against the Romans led by a man named Bar Kokhba, who became known as Bar Kokhba, the son of the star. And this was an allusion to Balaam's oracle. And he was, a bit of a brute. There is a story that he had a disagreement with the rabbi one time and he kicked him to death. But, if you're going to fight the Romans, that's the kind of leader you need. And he was hailed as Messiah by Rabbi Akiba. But when he was killed, it was assumed that, well, he wasn't the Messiah after all. There were a number of such figures in the first century and even at the time of the first war against Rome as well. Now, in the case of Jesus of Nazareth, it is apparent that his followers came to believe that he was the Messiah. Now, I think they must have come to believe that before the crucifixion. If you accept the story of Palm Sunday, when Jesus enters Jerusalem and his followers get excited and they're shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David," this is really what leads to Jesus being crucified. The Romans crucified first and asked questions after. They weren't really going to examine the nuances as to Jesus' intentions of whether he was trying to establish a kingdom in Jerusalem. If some people thought he was, that was reason enough to get rid of him. Now, why people thought Jesus was the Messiah is the more difficult question, because he did not at all really fit the job description that you get, say, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. He was not a plausible candidate to be a mighty warrior who would overthrow the Romans. There were other ideas of a Messiah around at the time. Another one that you get in the Dead Sea Scrolls is a priest who will restore the temple cult. But Jesus doesn't seem to be that either. And the one that I think maybe have contributed something to it was you could get some references to a prophetic Messiah. In Isaiah chapter 61, the prophet says that the Lord has anointed me. And this is the text that Jesus supposedly read in the synagogue in Capernaum. But I think probably what contributed most to the idea that Jesus was the Messiah was that he went around preaching that the kingdom of God is at hand. Whatever he meant by it. And I will leave it to the professors of New Testament to sort out for you what Jesus might have meant by that. But the fact that he was preaching that the kingdom of God was at hand, I think led many of his followers to assume that he was the one who was going to bring it about. Now, normally speaking, if somebody is thought to be a Messiah and gets crucified, that should be the end of the discussion, or so you would think. In the case of Jesus, it wasn't. Now, I think it is well attested that within a few days, some of his followers came to believe that he had risen from the dead. The initial basis for that, I think, was visions. Again, what you make of visions is an open question, but I don't think there's any doubt that people have visions. And people do, on occasion, have visions of people who are dead. and especially people who were very important to them. But this led the followers of Jesus to go back to the scriptures. And what you get in a lot of the New Testament is searching the scriptures, to find something that could be taken as a prophecy of what actually happened to Jesus. Now, a couple of things were very important for that. One was the passage about a suffering servant of the Lord in the book of Isaiah. But now, nobody in Judaism at that time thought the suffering servant was a Messiah. So you might reinterpret it that way in light of what happened to Jesus, but this was not a standard idea. What was more helpful ultimately to the early Christians, I think, was Daniel chapter 7. Because here you have a Messiah, and by the time of Jesus, this figure was understood to be a Messiah. We have a couple of witnesses to that. And he was a Messiah who was not the standard traditional kind of Messiah who would lead an army on earth against the Romans. He was somebody who would come on the clouds of heaven. I think it's unlikely that Jesus identified himself as the Son of Man who would come on the clouds of heaven. He may, although it's very debatable, he may have cited Daniel 7, and there are passages in the New Testament where he says, "You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven." But if he did, I doubt that he would have explicitly identified himself with that figure, because it wouldn't have made much sense to people while he was actually on earth. After his death, though, the way the story goes in the book of Acts is that then he is taken up to heaven. And once he is back in heaven, and in the Stephen speech in Acts, he is seated at the right hand of God, and then he can come again in power from there. Now, I think that belief and that identification of Jesus, which you get in the synoptic gospels, which by and large, give you the part of the New Testament that is in a kind of credible idiom for the first century in Palestine. This, I think, made possible for the followers of Jesus to say that Jesus was the Messiah after all. It's just that he will have to come back and finish the job. The belief that he was risen from the dead was made credible by the expectation that there would be a general resurrection at the end of time. You get this most explicitly, I think, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul says that if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is not risen. The whole idea, the credibility of the idea that somebody was raised from the dead depended on having an apocalyptic view of history, which Paul most certainly did. So that when he affirmed that Jesus was risen from the dead, this wasn't to be an isolated miracle. This was to be the first fruits of the general resurrection. In other words, it's like seeing the first daffodil in spring. There ought to be more to follow. It's a sign of the times, not just of a particular unique individual. So I think this is what made possible the interpretation of Jesus as Messiah, even after his death. And this is really what gets Christianity going in the New Testament. Anybody got any question about any of that? You can just speak up. Now, it's a difficult question to know how many people in ancient Judaism thought this way. How widespread were these kind of apocalyptic ideas? We get them in the Dead Sea Scrolls, with some variations. According to the New Testament, the Pharisees believed in resurrection, whereas the Sadducees didn't. Now, nobody, to our knowledge, took a poll, so there's no way of knowing, how many people believed in resurrection, how many people were expecting a Son of Man to come on the clouds of heaven. My guess is that that kind of belief fluctuated, and that there was a lot more of it at the time of the war against Rome, when it looked like something catastrophic was happening. But we don't know. I think those ideas were well known, reasonably widespread, but it certainly wasn't the case that everybody believed them. The apocalypses that we have a cluster of them around the time of the Maccabean revolt. That's Daniel and some of the parts of First Enoch. Now, obviously, I think that was triggered by the fact that the attempt to suppress the traditional Jewish cult was traumatic, and so it seemed like the sky was falling in. Now, equally, you have a cluster of them in reaction to the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome. There is one called Fourth Ezra, which is quite a remarkable composition, and another called Second Baruch, both of which seem to have been written. They're both really reflections on the destruction of Jerusalem, and they both end up affirming that there is a coming divine intervention. Fourth Ezra talks about a man who rises up out of the sea. It seems to get the imagery a little bit mixed up, but he's obviously a reinterpretation of Daniel's Son of Man. In this case, he takes his stand on Mount Zion, and a host of nations comes to attack him, and that's an obvious allusion to Psalm 2. And then, of course, he defeats the nations, and then you have the general resurrection that follows. So I think by the end of the first century, those ideas were fairly widespread. How widespread they were in the time of Jesus is an open question. It does not seem to me that the people who followed Jesus in his earthly career, they were not expecting the Son of Man to appear on the clouds of heaven. They were perhaps, or some of them at least, were expecting that when Jesus went up to Jerusalem, somehow they would overthrow the Romans. I think the interpretation of Jesus as the Son of Man presupposes belief that he was raised from the dead and taken up to heaven. And that is what makes that whole system of belief possible. So in other words, I think if you hadn't had the development of apocalypticism, of apocalyptic thinking, Christianity could not have arisen in the way that it did. After the wars against Rome, Jews generally turned away from this kind of literature. You get some examples of it in the early Middle Ages, but on the whole, I think Judaism rejected it. The books of Enoch and the books Fourth Ezra and Second Baruch, those were all preserved by Christians in translation. But even though they were written in either Aramaic or Hebrew in the first case, the only apocalypse that made it into the canon was the book of Daniel. And that's quite intriguing as to why that was so. It didn't seem quite as far-fetched, I suppose, as some of the visions of Enoch. It was maybe more like the canonical prophets. But in any case, it was the only apocalypse that was accepted in the Hebrew canon. On the other hand, apocalypticism became very typical of Christianity, and indeed has remained very typical of it down to modern times. Any questions? Oh, yes, please.
Professor Colin, I want to ask about the tradition of Messianic movement. How the Jewish people think about the Messiah? Is it do you think of it a heroic figure that bring political liberation, and from generation to generation? So every generation they will have that kind of figure, or it's like a ultimate Messiah that is from God?
Well, I don't think it's something they expected in every generation. Mm-hmm. One would do if he did the job right. What they were expecting was a definitive restoration. So, what sets up the problem is that there was supposed to be a promise to David that one of his descendants would always sit on the throne in Jerusalem. And this lasted for a few hundred years, and then the Babylonians came along. And so after the Babylonian exile, you have an unfulfilled promise. And the solution to that was that, well, God will bring a Messiah in the end of days. Now, I think the expectation in most cases was that he would raise up a king, a human king, ideally from the line of David, who would restore the kingdom and then, would live out his life and be succeeded by his son, probably reestablish a dynasty. They were not necessarily expecting one Messiah, who would live forever. But you do get variations on it, and the most important of these variations was this one like a son of man. And originally, I think he was not supposed to be a Messiah at all. He was supposed to be a heavenly deliverer, an angel. But then that gets reinterpreted. And then the Messiah gets to be thought of as somebody who will come from heaven. And in that case, then you would get a definitive transformation. So you wouldn't necessarily have to pass on the kingdom from one generation to another. It would just be one that would last forever. Does that answer your question?
So they're expecting a ultimate human king who bring the dynasty back, and then that dynasty also become a spiritual kingdom.
Yeah,
that
in the later development of it, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Any other question or comment? Now, you will have opportunity on Wednesday to raise questions. I hope some of you will. Anything related to the book as a whole, anything you wanted to know about the Old Testament and were afraid to ask. This is your last opportunity coming up on Wednesday. That is, unless you want to buttonhole the TFs and have a final section. But so I will talk initially about the canon, how these books came to be regarded as scripture, what we mean by that, what you can legitimately expect from books like this, and take it from there. Okay, Jonathan and Nyla, hang on for a few minutes, and see the rest of you on Wednesday, I hope.